Now what we want to do is we want to have another short interview, and I'm inviting up my intern out of the Center for Howard Hendricks Center for Christian Leadership and Cultural Engagement. I always like saying that. Mikel Del Rosario is going to come, and he's going to ask me the questions. It's kind of awkward to kind of introduce, but anyway, so Mikel, come on up, and we'll do this, and I'm interested to see what you want to ask me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bock. I really appreciate the time that we spent together and the time that you've been able to share with us tonight. I really like the story that you shared about your grandkids. And I think a lot of us can relate to that, those of us who are parents or have kids in our lives. You know, my son can recite Lord of the Rings quotes all day long. You know, he's never read the books. He lives in this oral culture.
My grandkids know Star Wars backwards and forwards. It is your destiny.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So I had a question actually about song lyrics, as I'm thinking about how this Chinese whispers thing comes up in student ministry as well, and how we view song lyrics in our culture almost as a tradition. Mm-hmm. So to the point where you'll have people posting the lyrics to a song online, and then you'll have preteens and teenagers come and correct them. Mm-hmm. You know, how does that fit into the three categories that you shared, and is this something that we can use to help our skeptical friends understand orality a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's another good illustration of the type of thing that we're talking about. I tell people that most people don't learn the words to Amazing Grace by sitting down, I've got an exam tomorrow on Amazing Grace, and I'm going to learn these 4 verses of Amazing Grace. No, they learn Amazing Grace because they hear it again and again and again and again. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And eventually it sinks in. In fact, it sinks in to the point that when you hear the tune, the words pop in your head.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how orality works. In the few areas where we work orally, okay, we get glimpses of what it's like to live in the oral world when that's the only world you live in. Mm-hmm. See, I think the hard thing for us is to think through what it's like to live in a purely oral world. None of us can do that, and we can't replicate it. That's also why I have questions about some of the studies that are done today, because many of the studies that are done today are done with people who live in a mixed world in which they work with their memory in a variety of situations as opposed to strictly orally. Mm-hmm. But I think that the idea of music lyrics is a good example. I think the veteran example that I got last week is another good additional example of that kind of thing, along with the picture of the grandkids and the picture of what we do when we remember someone's life after they've passed away. I think these are the closest analogies to orality that we get in our world. And the important thing about some of them is some of them are corporate memories as opposed to individual memories. It's not just the memory of one person you're relying on. You're relying on the memory of several people, and in some cases several people working together to remember what happened. Mm-hmm. That's important as well.
No, that's helpful. Yeah. Now, you talked about this idea of many miracle workers. Mm-hmm. There are a dime a dozen. Some of us hear it a little bit differently, though. There's a YouTube video that's been out where Michael Shermer from Skeptic Magazine is saying how there was a whole bunch of different messiahs that were out, and Penn and Teller picked this up in one of their shows, and there's a video on YouTube that's got millions of hits where they're like, there was a plague of messiahs. You know, how exaggerated is that, and does it really matter as far as helping our friends see the uniqueness of Christ given the kind of Messiah that he claimed to be?
Yeah, well, the angel is in the details, okay? All right? Because when you look at these multiple Messiah accounts that are sometimes come out of the first century, the statement is usually made, there were many messianic figures or people claiming to be Messiah in the first century. That's actually true. Mm-hmm. But what it's not telling you, this is Paul Harvey's The Rest of the Story, okay, what the rest of the story is that the bulk of those examples are associated with Rome's war with Israel in the 60s and 70s of the first century, long after the time of Jesus. A few of them appear in the tension when Rome begins to impose taxes and take a census in the first decade of the first century. A couple of examples appear there in revolutionary reaction to that act of Rome. But the bulk of the examples come later. So again, this impression is created by making an association with Jesus to a time, and the bulk of the examples are late as opposed to fitting in the period that Jesus belongs to. So the claim ends up being an exaggerated claim, if I can say it that way. There is no doubt that there was messianic fervor in the first century. You have the Qumran community of the Dead Sea Scrolls living out in the desert, waiting for the return of Messiah. There was a lot of expectation and a lot of hope. But almost all the messianic expectations that you have in the first century have a strictly powerful Messiah. You know, one of the things that makes Jesus' Messiahship unique is the fact that he suffered as Messiah. He wasn't just victorious. In fact, this gave the disciples all kinds of headaches initially, so much so that when Jesus first announced that he was going to suffer, Peter took Jesus aside in a little Christology 101 class and said, "Let me teach you some Christology, Jesus." He said, you know, basically the idea is the Messiah is not going to suffer, and Jesus didn't exactly pay his top student a compliment. He said, "Get behind me, Satan," because he hadn't integrated the suffering elements of Messiah alongside the victorious elements and powerful elements of Messiah. So this is another element where the tradition is distinct. We don't have any examples that I'm aware of, any other examples of a messianic claim that has suffering as a part of it. Okay? So just like there are aspects of Jesus' miracles that show him to be unique, there are aspects of Jesus' messiahship that also point to his uniqueness.
Excellent. That's helpful for us to dialogue sometimes with our skeptical friends, our relatives who watch these things on YouTube and then bring it up. I was at one of these family gatherings once, and somebody cornered me and wanted to talk about the resurrection. And so we went through some of the evidence, and at the very end of that talk, she was like, you know, Mikel, something happened. I don't know what happened, but something happened. How often do you think in our conversations that people are resisting the historical conclusion only because they're resisting the theological implication of a historical conclusion? And where can we go when the conversation ends up like that?
Well, I think that that's a great observation. I mean, I think it's important that people know I did not grow up in a Christian home. In fact, I was listening to Lee Strobel's story, and I went, man, that could be my story. I was very much, I would say I was an agnostic. I wouldn't say I was an atheist growing up, but I was very agnostic, just stayed away from religious claims all the way through high school. I had people witnessing with me from the time I was in 8th grade in junior high all the way through my senior year in high school. Most of them were Baptists. And in the midst of sharing me, the first person who shared with me, he now teaches ethics out at Talbot Biola, someone you know, Scott Ray, shared with me after coming back from a Young Life camp, and his entire evangelistic message was, you need Jesus, you need Jesus, you need Jesus. Couldn't tell me why, whether he just knew I needed Jesus. I thought he was crazy. He had just come out of the 8th grade and had gone to Young Life camp. And people shared with me all the way through. My spiritual experience was so deep that this was the prayer that I prayed before I went to college my freshman year. The prayer that I prayed before my freshman year was at SMU. I was in Bose Hall 3 East. And I prayed, this prayer is so chock full of theological error, it's amazing. But here it goes. Dear God, I don't know if you exist. That was how it began. But if you do, okay, don't give me a Bible-carrying Southern Baptist as a roommate because I want to enjoy my college years. Amen. Okay? Okay? That was the entire prayer. I was getting a potluck roommate. A potluck roommate is a bad deal. Okay? That's like getting married without getting engaged. All right? So I had no idea who I was going to live with the next year. I just knew the school was going to choose it. So I pray this prayer. And in the midst of praying this prayer, you know, I'm hoping that God will grant my wish. And so I go up to Bose 3 East, and I open the door, and there are these trunks. Only this wasn't a military trunk in camouflage. This was in red and blue because, you know, it's the Mustangs. And on top of that trunk, sitting right smack in the middle, was a Holy Bible. Okay? All right? By the way, I think every Bible is holy, but that's a whole other matter, okay? But they call it the Holy Bible. It was a Holy Bible sitting there. I didn't have to ask his denomination. My roommate, Doug Mickey, attended First Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia. And I'll tell you what he did for me. He lived an authentic Christian life. And in living that authentic Christian life, the evidences that he would talk about, and sometimes he knew the answers to my question. I used to love to ask Doug and other Christians who would share with me. When they get close, your question was about getting close because of the theological implications. When they get close, I would say, all of a sudden I would develop this terrific compassion for Africans. Okay? I would ask, what about the lost in Africa? And you know what's beautiful about Christians? They're hungry people. Okay? That was like throwing raw meat to someone, all right? And they would go after the answer to my question. And I was off the hook because now we were talking about people in Nairobi. Okay? So that was great for me. So, yes, oftentimes I think people coming from the skeptical side, if you get close, what they will do is they will throw up a deflection shield. Okay? And they will deflect you in a different direction and try and get you off the target of challenging them. Now, what do you do in that situation? I think still what you do is you're patient. You're patient. There are times to move in, and there are times to give space. What you want to keep, what you want to do is you want to keep the opportunity of keeping the conversation alive over time. And so you have to think about how to deal with that. The way Doug Mickey did it was he just lived his life. He tried to answer my questions when he could. When he couldn't answer questions, he would bring in his friends. They eventually gave me a Bible, a Phillips translation. And they said to me, Darrell, we think you're a fairly smart guy, so why don't you just start with just a New Testament. Just start at the beginning. Now, they tell me, don't get hung up in the genealogy, okay? Get past the genealogy. And then just ask yourself one question. This was the greatest move anyone made in trying to bring me to the Lord. Just ask one question. How central is Jesus Christ to the story? We think you can figure that out. And the point they were trying to make is, because I thought Jesus, he's a great religious figure, he's a terrific prophetic figure, but he's not the middle of the story. Just ask yourself that. When I got to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus began to say, he who builds his house on the rock, is able to withstand the storm, and the one who builds on the sand gets swept away. All of a sudden I realized, oops, Jesus is at the center of this story. And it became clear that it wasn't a matter of putting Jesus in a religious hall of fame. What was important was to understand that Jesus was making claims of being at the center of the program of God. Mm-hmm. By the way, you can get there, this is a little hint, you can get there by just having Jesus be the Christ. If Jesus is the Christ, he's at the center of God's program, and then you begin to ask, what kind of Christ is he? And that may take you to heaven. So, point being, I think oftentimes people do step back because you get close, and then it's the better part of wisdom and discernment. And I think you keep a line open to the Holy Spirit while you're doing this as to when to press and when to give space to keep that conversation alive.
Well, thank you, Dr. Bock. We're at the end of our time here today, but I want to thank you so much for sharing with us and for answering our questions. So thank you.